Here's a short, powerful hook you can open the story with. I wasn't looking for anything that day, but the moment her hand touched mine, the world around me disappeared. And suddenly, it was only her. Do you want me to shape a few alternate hooks too? Some softer, some more dramatic, so you can choose the best fit for your narration style? It was one of those afternoons that seemed designed for quiet reflection, the kind where the rain draws silver lines against the windows and the world outside moves at half its usual speed. I ducked into a small cafe I'd never been to before, mostly to escape the damp chill. The door closed behind me with a soft chime, and I was welcomed by the warm hum of conversation, the earthy scent of roasted coffee, and the faint crackle of an old jazz record playing from somewhere near the counter. I remember shaking the water from my jacket and looking around for a place to sit. That's when I saw her. She was by the window, tucked into the corner where the light was softest. A book rested open in her hands, though it didn't seem like she was reading it. Her gaze lingered on the page as if her thoughts were miles away. There was a kind of elegance in the way she sat, poised yet comfortable, her legs crossed, a scarf draped casually around her shoulders. She wasn't trying to be noticed, and that made it impossible not to. For a moment, I stood there longer than I should have, just watching. There was something magnetic about her presence, something unspoken that drew me in. Not the kind of attraction that crashes into you all at once, but the quieter kind, the kind that pulls at your attention until you realize you've forgotten why you came in at all. I finally ordered a coffee, my voice lower than usual, as though the cafe's hush demanded respect. The barista gave me a polite nod, and while I waited, I stole another glance at the woman by the window. This time, as if sensing the weight of my attention, she lifted her eyes. It was only a brief moment, but it struck me with surprising force. Her eyes were calm, knowing, with a warmth that softened everything around them. And when the corners of her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, I felt as if she had just pulled me into her quiet world. I took my coffee and looked for a seat, but the cafe was nearly full. The only open space was a table a few feet from hers. I hesitated, wondering if it would seem too obvious, too forward, but something in her expression gave me the courage to move. So I sat, the wooden chair creaking softly beneath me, and tried to steady the flutter in my chest. The rain outside tapped steadily against the glass, and the soft lamp overhead cast a golden glow across her table, lighting her features in a way that made her seem timeless. She turned a page, her fingers delicate against the worn paper, and for some reason that simple gesture made me wonder about her life, what she had seen, what she had carried, what she had let go of. And that's when I knew this wasn't just another stranger in a cafe. Something about her presence was going to stay with me, long after the rain stopped. I had just settled into the table near her when it happened. That small, ordinary moment that somehow feels like the beginning of something. I was unwrapping the sleeve from my coffee, letting the steam warm my hands, when her voice slipped gently into the air between us. "Rain like this makes the whole city feel smaller, doesn't it?" she said. It wasn't a question I needed to answer, not really, but the way she said it, measured, thoughtful, with a smile tugging at the edge of her lips, pulled me into a reply before I even realized it. "Yeah," I said, glancing toward the window, like everything slows down just for a little while. She tilted her head, considering my words as though they carried more weight than I'd meant them to. And then she closed her book, resting it gently on the table. It was an old, worn paperback, the spine softened with years of use. That small gesture alone felt like an invitation. I couldn't stop myself. "What are you reading?" She slid a hand over the cover, almost protective. "Something I've read too many times to count. Sometimes it's nice to come back to a familiar story." Her eyes lifted to mine again, steady, curious. "Do you read much?" I gave a short laugh. "Not as much as I should. Mostly things I have to read. Rarely what I want." Her smile widened, just slightly, the kind that made me feel like she was seeing more than I was saying. "That changes," she said softly. "Sometimes all it takes is the right book or the right moment." I don't know why her words lingered with me the way they did. Maybe it was the cadence of her voice, smooth, warm, a little lower than I expected. Or maybe it was the way her hand rested so close to mine on the table, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her skin. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help noticing the small details. The curve of her wrist, the delicate lines that told a story of years lived with grace. She wore no ring. For some reason, that realization made my heart beat just a little faster. The conversation began to unfold on its own, like a thread unraveling smoothly. We spoke about little things, the rain, the neighborhood, the cafe itself. Yet, beneath the lightness of it all, there was a current of something unspoken. She laughed once, a quiet, unhurried sound that seemed to wrap around me, warm and steady. And I remember thinking how strange it was to be sitting across from someone I had known for only minutes, yet feeling as though I'd been waiting much longer to hear that laugh. When she leaned forward to make a point, her scarf slipped slightly off her shoulder, and in the smallest of accidents, her arm brushed against mine. It was nothing, barely a touch, light as breath, but it jolted through me, sharp and unexpected. I looked up, and for a second, our eyes locked. Neither of us spoke, but I swear something passed between us, something neither of us dared name. Not yet. And just like that, a simple conversation had become something else entirely. The minutes slipped by almost unnoticed. What began as small talk had begun to feel like something else, like a current running quietly beneath the surface, pulling us both along. She told me about the book in her hands, how she'd first read it years ago during a difficult season of her life. There was a softness in the way she spoke, as though she wasn't just sharing words, but little fragments of herself. I found myself leaning in without realizing it, wanting to catch every syllable. At one point, she laughed at something I said, a clumsy attempt at humor about how the cafe's chairs seemed determined to creak at the worst possible times. But the sound of her laughter made me lose track of my own joke. It was low, warm, unhurried, and it lingered in the air between us far longer than it should have. When her laughter faded, she gave me a look, half teasing, half curious. "You're how old?" "23," she asked, her tone light but her eyes searching. "24," I admitted, suddenly aware of how young that sounded in comparison to the calm composure sitting across from me. Her smile widened, though not unkindly. You're practically a baby." The words might have stung, but there was no sharpness in them. Instead, her gaze lingered on me, steady and thoughtful, as if she was studying something she hadn't expected to find. I felt heat rise in my face, not from embarrassment, but from the way she said it, with a mixture of amusement and something quieter, something that trembled just beneath the surface. She leaned across the table then, her scarf brushing against the wood as she emphasized a point about her favorite scene in the book. Her shoulder brushed mine, barely, fleeting, but enough to make my chest tighten. It was such a small thing, the kind of contact that could have easily gone unnoticed. But the warmth of it burned into me, sharper than it should have, and for a moment I lost track of what she was even saying. I think she noticed. The way her eyes flicked to mine, just for a beat too long, told me she felt it too. But neither of us spoke of it. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the book, her fingers idly tracing the spine as if grounding herself. I watched the way the light caught the faint lines at the corners of her eyes when she smiled, the way her hair framed her face, soft and natural. She carried herself with a kind of grace that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with experience. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just drawn to her presence. I was fascinated by her, by the layers I could only begin to imagine, by the way she carried both confidence and a kind of unspoken vulnerability. The cafe around us hummed with life, but I barely heard it anymore. There was only her, and the quiet tension that grew stronger with every glance, every brush of her arm, every word left hanging in the air between us. And though we hadn't named it, though we hadn't dared to touch on it directly, I knew something was shifting, something neither of us had planned for, yet neither of us could ignore. I don't remember exactly what I was saying when it happened. Something small, something ordinary. Maybe a story about a class I was taking, or the way the city always felt different in the rain. I was halfway through a sentence when I tripped over my own words. It wasn't much, just a stumble, the kind of clumsy pause that comes when nerves betray you. But before I could laugh it off or correct myself, her hand reached across the table. She laid it gently over mine. It was such a simple gesture, so natural, yet it seemed to silence the world around me. Her touch wasn't heavy, just the soft weight of her palm against the back of my hand, her fingers curling lightly, as if to steady me. The warmth of her skin seeped into mine, traveling up my arm, settling in my chest. And in that instant, everything else disappeared. The cafe's hum of conversation faded. The rain against the windows dissolved into silence. Even my own restless thoughts stilled. There was only her, the warmth of her hand, the steadiness in her eyes, the quiet message that said more than words ever could. I looked down at her hand, resting on mine, noticing the small details I hadn't before, the smoothness of her skin, the faint trace of a ring once worn but no longer there, the way her thumb brushed, almost absently, against my knuckle. A single movement, barely there, yet it sent a shiver through me. When I lifted my gaze back to hers, she was watching me closely, not in a way that demanded an answer, but in a way that invited me to simply be present. Her eyes were steady, calm, but behind them was something unspoken, something that made my chest ache with the need to understand it. I forgot what I've been talking about. I forgot about the coffee cooling in front of me, the other people shifting in their chairs, the soft clink of cups and spoons all around us. I forgot where I was. For those few suspended seconds, I was nowhere and everywhere at once. I was just with her. Neither of us said anything. Words would have broken the spell. Instead, I let myself feel the quiet intensity of that touch, the way it grounded me and set me adrift at the same time. Eventually, she pulled her hand back, slowly, as though reluctant to let go. The absence of her touch was immediate, leaving a ghost of warmth against my skin. I flexed my fingers once, almost instinctively, as though trying to hold on to it. She smiled then, not a wide smile, but a small, knowing one. "See?" she said softly, almost teasing, almost tender. "You don't have to try so hard." And in that moment, I realized she had done more than steady my words. She had shifted something inside me. With just one simple touch, she had made me forget the world outside, forget my own nerves, forget everything but her. The silence after her touch lingered, soft and heavy, like the air after rain. I didn't want to break it, but eventually, words found their way back between us. Only this time, they came slower, quieter, more deliberate. She leaned back slightly, fingers curling around her coffee cup, though she didn't drink from it. She just held it, as though the warmth anchored her. Her eyes lowered to the table for a moment before lifting again to meet mine. There was a hesitation there, small, but enough to tell me that what she was about to say mattered. "I don't usually," she began, then stopped. She exhaled, shaking her head as though laughing at herself. "I don't usually let people in so easily. Not anymore." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a tiredness, a weight carefully carried. I wanted to ask why, but I stayed quiet, letting her take her time. She didn't need questions. She needed space. "Too many letdowns," she continued softly, her gaze fixed on the cup in her hands. "Too many people who said one thing and did another. After a while, you stop expecting anything real." The words hung between us, raw and unguarded. I felt them settle inside me, heavy but true. Without thinking, I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. My voice came out lower than I expected. "I get that. For me, it's different, but kind of the same. People see me, and all they notice is my age. Like I can't possibly have anything worth saying, like I haven't lived enough to matter yet." She looked up then, eyes sharp but softening as they locked onto mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was only the quiet recognition that passed between us, that strange relief of being understood without needing to explain further. Her hand, almost absent-mindedly, reached across the space again, not to cover mine this time, but to toy gently with the sleeve of my jacket. Just her fingertips brushing along the fabric, back and forth, as though grounding herself in the simple act of contact. The gesture was small, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to me it felt enormous. Each sweep of her touch sent a ripple through the silence, reminding me she wasn't just speaking her truths, she was trusting me with them. "I guess," she said softly, almost to herself, "we both have our reasons for keeping walls up. And maybe," I offered, my chest tightening, "sometimes the right person comes along and makes it feel safe to lower them. Just a little." Her eyes softened, her lips curving into the faintest smile. She didn't reply, not with words. Instead, she let her hand rest against my sleeve for a moment longer before pulling back, curling it once more around her coffee cup. But the warmth of her touch lingered, and so did the fragile, unspoken bond forming between us, built not on grand declarations, but on the quiet, steady courage of shared vulnerabilities. The cafe had grown quieter as the afternoon slipped toward evening. A few tables had emptied, the rhythm of spoons against cups had slowed, and the rain outside had softened into a drizzle. Yet, inside, the air between us felt heavier than ever, dense with everything neither of us had said aloud. We drifted into silence, not the awkward kind, but the kind that carries weight. She traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger, her gaze fixed on the window beside us. The soft glow from the streetlight outside caught the edges of her face, painting her in muted gold. I wanted to reach for her hand again, to feel that quiet steadiness she'd given me before. But something in her posture held me back. Her shoulders were a little too still, her breaths a little too measured. It was as though a thought had caught hold of her, and she wasn't ready to let me see it. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than before. "You know, people would look at us and see something unusual." Her words landed gently, but they sank deep. She didn't have to explain. I knew what she meant. The difference in years, the way it might look from the outside. Two lives that weren't supposed to intersect in this way. I swallowed, unsure how to answer. "Maybe," I said quietly. "But does that make it wrong?" She turned then, her eyes meeting mine. There was conflict in them, a tug-of-war between desire and restraint. For a moment, I thought she might answer, but instead she just shook her head lightly, as though to chase away the thought. Her fingers lifted to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed the faint tremor in her hand. It wasn't nervousness exactly, more like the tremble of someone fighting against their own heart. The urge to close the distance between us pressed hard in my chest. To tell her that none of it mattered, that what I felt in her presence outweighed every outside opinion. But I stayed where I was, rooted by respect, by hesitation, by fear of shattering the fragile moment we were holding. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You're young. You don't see all the complications yet." "Maybe not," I admitted. My voice was steady, though my pulse wasn't. "But I know what feels real." The silence that followed was charged, every second stretching longer than it should. My eyes fell to her hands resting on the table, and I watched as her fingers curled slightly, as if resisting the urge to reach for me again. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The streets glistened under the soft glow of lamps, and the world looked freshly washed, renewed. But inside, we sat suspended, two people bound by an unspoken longing, caught between the safety of distance and the risk of closeness. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. And yet, the air between us said everything. We both wanted more, even if neither of us dared to take it. By the time we noticed, the cafe had nearly emptied. Chairs were stacked near the counter, lights dimmed slightly, and the barista was wiping down the last few tables. Outside, the rain had stopped altogether, leaving the streets washed clean, their reflections shimmering under the street lamps. She glanced toward the window, then back at me, her expression softened by something I couldn't quite name. Reluctance, maybe, or resignation. Either way, I could feel the shift, the moment when something beautiful has to give way to the ordinary rhythm of life. "I should go," she said, her voice calm, but quieter than before. She began gathering her things, the scarf draped over her shoulders, the worn paperback resting on the table. Her movements were unhurried, as though each one bought us a few more seconds together. I nodded, though my chest ached at the thought of her leaving. Yeah, I guess we both should. We rose at the same time, chairs scraping gently against the floor. For a moment, we stood there facing each other, suspended between goodbye and something more. She was close, so close I could smell the faint trace of her perfume, something subtle and elegant, a scent that felt like it belonged only to her. I hesitated, unsure if I should reach for her, unsure if it would be welcome, but she solved the moment for me. With a small, almost decisive movement, she stepped forward and slipped her arms around me. The hug was soft at first, tentative, but then she lingered, her cheek resting lightly against my chest, her body fitting against mine with quiet ease. I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, unhurried but sure, and the warmth of her presence seeped into me in a way that words could never capture. I wrapped my arms around her carefully, not wanting to hold too tight, but afraid to let go too soon. The world outside could have vanished entirely, and I wouldn't have noticed. All I knew was the closeness of her, the weight of her trust, the unspoken comfort of being allowed to hold her like this. When she finally pulled back, she did so slowly, as if reluctant to break the contact. Her hands brushed lightly along my arms before falling away. She looked up at me then, her smile small but real. "Thank you," she whispered. She didn't explain what for, and I didn't ask. Some things don't need explanation. I only nodded, my throat tight. "Anytime." She turned toward the door, her scarf falling into place as she walked. And as the bell above the cafe door chimed softly behind her, I realized something I hadn't before. I didn't know if I would see her again. I didn't know what, if anything, this would become. But none of that mattered in that moment. Because with just one simple touch, her hand on mine, her arms around me, she had given me something lasting. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I carried it with me. The warmth of her presence, the quiet hope that sometimes even the briefest encounters can change everything.